Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time today to join us for the last section of the 2018 OWHE webinar series. Today, we're going to hear about Gender 101 from Brianna Stansberry. And so, Brianna, do you want to take it away?
My name is Brianna Stansberry. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm the interim coordinator for the Multicultural Center here at Portland Community College Southeast. Thank you all for being here and for taking potentially your lunch hour to chat together about gender. The genesis of this webinar really came out of last year's conference where folks engaged in some productive and critical dialogue around gender. And a way that this dialogue came together was the result of an unconference session that someone proposed entitled, "What is a Woman Anyway?" And I had the opportunity and honor to sit with colleagues across Oregon and have some really productive discourse around what gender is. So a little background about me, I'm pretty intrigued and interested in gender. My undergraduate degree is in gender and feminist studies, and I recently left working in a women's resource center at Portland Community College Cascade. I also did a portion of my graduate work at a women's resource center at Portland State University, and I continue to work in identity-based equity centers where conversations around intersectional identities are embedded in the work. Before we jump into content, I do want to acknowledge a few things. The first is that I am a queer, cisgender woman of color. The part I really want to pull out of that lineup of identities is the word cisgender, which is spelled C-I-S, gender. And the Latin root of cis means to be on this side of. Cisgender means that when I was born, I was assigned female at birth by a doctor. And as I've grown up, I agree with that doctor's verdict, and my gender identity is a woman. And so a cisgender person is a person who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth. And we'll dive more into this, but I think it's important to acknowledge that as a cisgender person, I hold a lot of privilege. And it's important to honor that most of this work around gender has largely been done by transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks. I'll include some resources at the end of this webinar from an organization called the Trans Student Educational Resources, as well as continue to honor and offer thanks to all the incredible people who are engaging in this work and continuing to push it forward. And those are folks who are often on the margins. I also want to acknowledge that we are engaging in a conversation about identity, and we're doing so while occupying stolen land where people's identities were systemically and institutionally stripped and colonized. I want to honor that this land is the land of the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Kathlamet, Clackamas, bands of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. I'm honored by the collective work of many Native Nations leaders and families who are demonstrating resilience, resistance, revitalization, healing, and creativity. I'm honored to be guests upon this land. I want to thank you all for being here, and also thanks to colleagues at Portland State University's Indigenous Nations Studies program for crafting a portion of the acknowledgement. Okay, so let's jump in. A little bit of a housekeeping. I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So if you're tuning in with a partner or another person, know that there will be prompts for you to engage in. If you're tuning in alone, feel free to grab a piece of paper and do some note jotting to the prompts that I'll be offering. So I'd like to start off by doing sort of a DYAD share around what is the first time you can remember getting gendered messaging. An example of this could be, I'd like to give a personal example of this so that it feels a little bit more tangible. I remember as a kiddo, I was washing my car with my dad and my older brother, and I was probably about 3 or 4, and it was a warm summer day, and we were outside washing the car, and my brother and my dad took off their shirts to wash the car, and so did I, because I saw that my brother and my dad did, and I remember really distinctly feeling like that was not okay. And I think my brother, even at the time, maybe he was 6, said something like, "Girls can't take their shirts off." And so it's a really poignant memory for me about messaging around what ways our bodies can operate in the world, depending on our genders. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to chat with a partner or note take on the first time you can remember getting gendered messaging. Okay, I'm going to pull everyone back. I hope that those conversations were fruitful and gave you some things to think about as we move forward. So with that as our foundation, I'd like to offer thinking about creating some gender boxes together. When I run this workshop, or when the PCC QRC coordinators, Career Resource Center coordinators, run this workshop, we like to break open the gender boxes. So we would physically create these gender boxes on like a whiteboard or flip chart paper. So if you ever run a Gender 101 presentation and want to borrow this technique, feel free. But we create a woman box or a girl's box and a boy's box or a men box. And we ask students to fill in these boxes. What does society say about women and girls? What does society say about men and boys? And we ask folks to consider personality traits, actions, and presentation. And I want to make distinct that this isn't what you think about women and girls or what you think about men and boys. This is about the societal, institutionalized, and systemic messaging of what girls do and what boys do, and what girls don't do and what boys don't do. And we'll literally, in person, kind of take these boxes and write in, what does a girl do? What does a boy do? So I'm going to give you just a minute to write down on a piece of paper, create a box on a piece of paper, and write down some of the traits, characteristics, and actions and presentations that girls do and boys do. I'll give you 1 minute to do that, and then we'll come back together and we'll talk about it. Okay, so some of the key things that folks pull out of this exercise is that women and girls are often told to be quiet or told to be ladylike, that they're often made more docile or submissive, that women are allowed to have emotions and maybe are too emotional or hysterical. And the messaging for boys and men is that they aren't allowed to have emotions. And if they do have emotions, those emotions have to be anger. Anger is a valid emotion for boys and men. Or that boys don't cry. So kind of relying on these tropes about what boys and men can do. Often students will pinpoint like aggression in the boys and men category and subservience in the men and girls category. Sometimes folks will pinpoint blue in the boys category and pink in the girls category. I think something that's really poignant to pull out is that we receive a lot of messaging around gender and gender expectations super early on, right? So in that DYAD share and the slide previously, most people can pull out a moment in time when they remember getting strong gendered messaging. It's also important to pull out that men and women are set up in contrast to each other. So these boxes are set up to be juxtaposed against each other. We know that these are just socially constructed, right? They're not real. And that the roles, because they're juxtaposed, are also super rigid, right? So they create roles that are unattainable and also really, really rigid. And that this messaging comes from tons of places. It's not just individual. This messaging comes from institutions like churches and clubs, and also from schools, and also from family and media and marketing. I want to just show a few images up on the screen that I think really highlight some of the ways that gendered messaging appears in the media and in marketing. I think that it's kind of illuminating to see. So here is a picture of yogi tea, and it's called men's tea. And so what we're seeing from this messaging is that in order to get men to drink tea, we have to say that it's specifically for men. And I think the messaging there, right, is that men don't drink tea, that men maybe drink coffee or beer, but they don't drink tea. And so to message and market tea to men, we have to specifically call it tea, men's tea, not just tea. The second image is of some Scotch tape, and it's hot pink, and it says, just for girls, and it has flowers all over it. And so the messaging here is that girls can't use just regular tape that everybody uses. Girls have to use tape that is specifically gendered, that is hot pink and covered in flowers, and that's how girls can engage with crafting. This third one I think is intriguing. It's a bounce ad, and it's bounce for men. And I think the part that really is striking to me is the tear off on the sides. The box looks like it's been torn apart, and it says pure sport at the bottom. And so it's connoting that in order to do something, a domestic chore, right? Like in order to be engaged in the domesticity of the house, to do laundry, men have to be messaged to that it's man's laundry. And that laundry, it's not even enough to just be messaged that it's for men. It has to also say that it's engaged in sports, right? To be active in household activities, which is a woman's gender role box. To be messaged in that means that we have to link that to sports. In the top left-hand corner, it also says for men and those who smell like them, or those who smell them. So I think that also kind of plays on these tropes around men and what they engage in and what they don't engage in. This image is of Bic pens, and it says Bic for her, and for her is in purple luminescent writing, and the pens themselves are pastel colors. So again, we're seeing sort of this like gentleness in the marketing praxis. We're seeing this like really intentional strategy to utilize particular colors, particular fonts to message to women, and to connote that women are this way, right? That women must be associated with these particular things. So all these messages really go back to these boxes that we just constructed together. This last image says sleep pretty in pink women's earplugs. So again, perfectly normal product that anybody could use is then messaged for women by being turned pink and having a specific sort of call out that because they're pink, they therefore belong to women, right? And we know that that's just not true. The way I like to end this slide is to point out that the impossibility of these boxes. No one fits into them. They're socially constructed, and they're super hazardous to our abilities to live truly authentic lives. And when I did this presentation on Gender 101 with a group last week, and we literally like erased the boxes off of the whiteboard, just as like a kinesthetic show that like these don't exist. Society places people into these boxes that are socially constructed and that nobody actually fits into perfectly, right? I will say too that even though these boxes are a lie, right? They're not real. The truths of their consequences are still super, super real to lots of folks. So I think that's a really important thing to point out.
Not a fight, not a read. Sorry. 3, 2, 1.
When we think of the word gender, a whole lot of images rush to mind.
Most of us are taught the idea
that people are born a boy or a girl.
And we're expected to act a certain way based on what's between our legs. But that actually isn't true for everyone.
It totally ignores the huge and amazing world of people who are trans and gender diverse.
And that's what we're going to dive into in this series.
Being trans, gender identity, and what it's all about.
Welcome to Trans 101. Traditionally, we tend to think of gender as decided by the body we're born in.
People are usually assigned female or male at birth.
But bodies and gender are actually pretty separate things.
Gender is basically part of someone's internal sense of self.
It can be male, female, neither, a mix of both, or exist totally outside of that. A person's relationship with their gender can also change over time as well.
The gender we're assigned at birth usually gets reinforced by the people around us over our lives.
Hearing things like, be a man, or you're such a girl.
It can feel like we're being told who we're supposed to be.
Most people feel comfortable with the gender that they're assigned. But for some people, that label never quite fits and doesn't feel right.
That's what's called being
Transgender.
You've probably heard the term transgender, or even gender diverse.
That's when your gender doesn't entirely match the one you're assigned at birth.
A lot of people use trans for short.
That can mean the gender you were assigned felt meaningless, restrictive, or altogether just didn't quite fit. That might seem like a pretty broad definition, and that's because it is.
And the most important thing you need to know, there's no one right way to be trans.
There are a lot of different ways people might identify.
It's not about knowing every single one.
But rather being open to difference when you encounter it.
And also keep in mind that gender and sexuality are largely separate things. Lesbian, bisexual, asexual, gay, and straight are a few different examples.
But we're all those things in addition to being trans.
They're not the reason we're trans.
I think for me, there's kind of been this expectation that I transitioned because I like guys and wanted to get with them more easily. Actually, I'm a super gay lesbian.
When we talk about gender identity, people often think of two opposing groups.
A binary of female and male. And that when you're trans, you go from one to the other. But there's a lot more to it than that.
Putting it simply, non-binary is an umbrella term people use
to describe gender that doesn't fit squarely into male or female.
And this can include people who feel that their gender is a mix of both.
Changes often, or is something totally separate.
Or have no strong sense of gender at all.
Different people might use more specific terms to describe their gender, whilst others use non-binary.
And trans people who aren't non-binary,
who identify as strictly male or female,
might describe themselves as binary.
There's also a term for people who aren't trans. That's cisgender.
Cisgender is a way of saying not trans.
You might also have heard this term as cis.
Being cisgender is when the gender you identify as totally matches the one you were assigned at birth.
The term comes from Latin, meaning on the same side as.
and is used in contrast with trans, which means on the other side of.
It might be a new word to get used to, but it helps avoid a contrast of trans people and normal people.
And instead, just recognize that being trans or cis are just different ways to be.
So if you're cisgender, this is a great word to add to your vocabulary.
Transitioning is when someone takes steps
to socially or physically feel more aligned with their gender identity.
First is social transitioning.
Social transitioning involves how we interact with people.
Such as coming out as transgender,
to ask people to use different words and pronouns to describe us,
or changing the way we interact with gendered spaces, like the bathroom we use.
Physically transitioning often involves a person altering their appearance.
To what feels right for them.
Like clothes, makeup and hair.
Or seeking medical support.
which can involve hormones or surgery. Transitioning isn't about appealing to other people.
or necessarily trying to look like a cisgender person.
It's about a trans person doing what feels right for them.
And what that means for each person is different.
It's also important to know that transitioning isn't instant.
There's a tendency to think of transitioning as something automatic, like there's a fairy godmother who will pop up and magically change everything. Transitioning is a gradual thing.
And everyone's different.
No two people transition the same way.
A trans person's identity isn't defined by the way they do or do not transition.
So if someone doesn't feel transitioning is for them, that's totally cool too.
Gender dysphoria is an intense discomfort a trans person may feel.
About physical attributes or the way that they're gendered by others.
Gender dysphoria can be on a social level, a physical level, or even a purely emotional level. Dysphoria can be really overwhelming sometimes.
Having to live with a body or expression you're not comfortable with can really impact the way you're living.
Trans people find different ways to alleviate dysphoria.
And the positive impact that can have is enormous.
Like transitioning, having dysphoria doesn't make someone more or less trans.
And it's not something all trans people experience.
There will be a lot of new words.
We often hear things like, that's grammatically incorrect.
Is that a real word?
Fine. You got us.
You couldn't get any store-bought brand name words.
So we have to go with garden grown that tries as nutritious.
In reality, all language evolves at a community level.
Every single word.
For trans people, we're developing language that describes who we are.
Because in the past, either a lot of the words haven't existed,
Or those that have been created by people outside the trans community.
And don't always reflect our experiences.
When you're talking about gender and bodies, talk about what you actually mean.
People have uteruses instead of women when talking about bodies.
Because some trans guys and non-binary people have those too. Or if you're talking about being a woman, avoid things like people with vaginas and just say woman, because not all women have those.
There's also never a need to say he/she when talking about a group of people.
They will do just fine.
it's shorter, less clunky, and more inclusive.
Using the right language makes trans people feel included, and it's actually more accurate as well.
Learning this stuff so you can be more informed is a pretty awesome thing to do.
So if you found this video helpful,
share it online so you can reach even more people.
And if you want to know more, check out the rest of Trans 101.
Full of even more awesome videos about gender diversity.
The different aspects of things that go into these boxes, and often this is labeled gender or sex characteristics, but in reality these can be broken down into 5 different categories. As you can see on the worksheet, each is a spectrum and not a fixed binary. I like to go through this resource. Some of you may have seen the gender unicorn. There's also a few years back circulating a gender bred person, and the gender bred person, just for a little bit of context and history, was actually co-opted by a group called, a man called, it's called Metrosexual was his website, and he's a white gay man who co-opted the gender bred person from trans folks of color. And so the community has really moved away from using the gender bred person and using the gender unicorn instead. So that's just a little history if you're wondering why I'm using the unicorn instead of the gender bred person. I like to walk through these 5 categories, and then if I'm ever using this as a teaching tool, I like to plot myself on this graphic. And so usually I'll print it out in a hard copy and give it to folks in case they want to plot themselves too. So if that's something you're interested in doing, I totally encourage you. It can be found on the TSER website, or you're welcome to take a screenshot of this. So we'll just walk through this together. Gender identity, and some of this will be a repeat from the YouTube video we just watched, but I think repetition can be helpful. So gender identity is one's internal sense of being male, female, neither of these, both of them, or another gender or genders. And everyone has a gender identity, including you. For transgender people, their sex assigned at birth and their own internal sense of gender identity are not the same. For female, women, and girl, and male, man, and boy are also not necessarily linked to each other, but are just 6 common gender identities. The next section is gender expression. And I like to say gender expression / presentation, which is the physical manifestation of one's gender identity through clothing or hairstyle, voice, body, etc. And most transgender people seek to make their gender expression, how they look, match their gender identity, who they are, rather than their sex assigned at birth. The next category is sex assigned at birth, and the assignment, which is the assignment and classification of people as male, female, intersex, or another sex based on a combination of anatomy, hormones, and chromosomes. It's important we don't simply use sex because of the vagueness of the definition of sex and its place in transphobia. Chromosomes are frequently used to determine sex from prenatal karyotyping, although not as often as genitalia. And chromosomes do not determine genitalia. The next one is physically attracted to or sexually attracted to, and that describes sexual orientation. The last one is emotionally or romantically attracted to, so who you find emotionally, who you're attracted to emotionally. I like to take a minute and plot myself and use it as a tool. So when I think about my gender identity, I identify as a woman, so I'd be on that, I'd put an X on the first line. My gender expression floats between feminine and occasionally a little bit masculine, so I'd be on the first line but closer to the dot on the left-hand side. I was assigned female at birth, so I'd put an X on the orange dot. I'm physically attracted to women, so I'd put an X on the top line. And I'm emotionally attracted to women, so I'd put an X on that top line. When I run this workshop with students, I usually give folks about 3 minutes to fill out their own gender unicorn. And we never share it or collect them or just clothes. It's just a way to individually reflect. So if you are with a partner and would like to plot yourself, or you'd like to just internally plot yourself on this chart, feel free. We'll stay here for just a second. And I want to thank you for taking the time to reflect. I know this stuff can be difficult to sift through. Sex, gender, and sexual orientation are a lot to unpack. It can be challenging to talk about because society has invested a lot in keeping people inside gender boxes. And so I like to think about, as we move through this slide, what happens when people step outside of those boxes, and what experiences happen when we don't meet society's expectation for the sex we were assigned at birth. As we move forward, I like to think about ways we can support students on our campus now that we have this knowledge. And I think one of the biggest and most salient ways is through education. So continuing to learn and engage in conversation with our colleagues is so vital. Like the video talked about, language is organic and it's rapidly, rapidly changing. When I was in college, the terminology that was used was preferred gender pronouns, or PGP. Now we recognize that pronouns shouldn't be a preference, they're mandatory. So the language has shifted to gender pronouns as a tangible way to create more inclusive and safer spaces instead of preferred gender pronouns. I mentioned my pronouns in my introduction. I think it's a really good way to break the ice in talking about pronouns. A pronoun is just a word that can function by itself as a noun phrase, and that refers to either the participants in the discourse or to someone or something mentioned elsewhere in the dialogue. Some people use binary pronouns like she, her, hers, and he, him, his, and lots of people use gender-neutral pronouns like they, them, and theirs. I haven't often heard z, zir, and zirs on my campus here at PCC Southeast, though I know it's floating a little bit. One of the QRC coordinators here said that it was really big in the 90s, but not as big now. So yeah, but it's still on there and it's still used. Pronouns are pretty important. Misgendering someone by not using the correct pronoun is super disrespectful and really dangerous. It would kind of be like if I told you that my name is Brianna, but you keep calling me Roger. And maybe the first time you get a pass because we just met and you forgot that my name's not Roger, it's actually Brianna. But if you continue to call me Roger and I've continued to correct you and engaged in the emotional labor of correcting you, maybe even my friends or community has engaged in that labor, and I keep telling you that my name is Brianna, then it tells me that you don't care about me or my existence to like try hard to get my name correct. So pronouns are really important and they're a really tangible way to respect people's identities. There is an activist, her name is Kat Black, and she does this awesome little bit about pronouns that I'm going to share with you now.
Pronoun is a word that takes place in a noun in a sentence. Words like he, her, his, and hers are all examples of pronouns that we commonly use. They're an integral part of how we communicate with each other, and most of us use them without thinking. But pronouns can be specifically important to those who identify both inside and outside of the gender binary. Terms like he and she are gendered pronouns that are in common use. We're used to looking at someone and assuming what their pronouns are, but assuming pronouns can impact trans and non-binary people in a very negative way. Misgendering is when you use a pronoun that does not reflect the identity of the person that you're addressing. As a trans woman, when I started my transition, misgendering is something that happened to me very often. I mean, I understood why it was happening. They had become accustomed to addressing me with pronouns that were generally associated with boys. But being misgendered made me feel miserable. I could be having an amazing day. I could look good and everything could be going well. But the moment that somebody would misgender me, my entire day, my entire week was ruined. And it was far more hurtful when it was done by people who claimed to care for me. Being misgendered felt like a knife at the back of my neck. It was completely emotionally draining to the point where, to be completely honest with you, I cut off a lot of my relationships. I don't experience misgendering at all now, but every time I visit my family, it happens non-stop. So long story short, I don't really have much of a relationship with my family. If you care about someone, you'll respect who they are. And part of respecting trans and non-binary people is using the right pronoun. I'm a trans woman. My identity is binary and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. My pronouns are non-negotiable, but there are some people who use preferred pronouns and some people who use more than one set of pronouns. I get it. It's confusing. And most trans and queer people understand that you're not going to get it at first, but once it's explained to you, it should be respected. Many people who do not identify within the confines of the gender binary opt to use the non-gendered pronoun they. Non-binary people are constantly having to defend why they use they pronouns. A popular rebuttal for this is that they is not grammatically correct when referring to a single person, which is silly because we use it that way all the time. If you're on a freeway and someone cuts you off and you don't have a view of the driver, you'll usually say, they cut you off. If you're at a restaurant for breakfast and the chef puts too much pepper on your eggs, you'll say, they over-seasoned it. Rain Rose, who previously went by the stage name Angel Hayes, has come out and said that they are agender and they prefer they, them, their pronouns. A great rule of thumb is if you don't know somebody's pronouns, using they, them, and their is pretty safe, but even better is asking. Communicating to a trans or queer person that you're open to using their pronouns can really, really change their day. Sometimes trans people, especially non-binary people, are so used to being misgendered that communicating to them that you're open to using their pronouns can alleviate a lot of stress. And by using them, you can encourage other people to use them as well. So if you're unsure, just politely pull them aside and ask them, what are your pronouns? Sometimes the answers might be confusing and you won't always understand why they use those pronouns, but don't challenge them on it. Remind yourself that their identity does not rely on your understanding and their gender is valid whether you understand it or not. It can take some adjusting and sure, you'll slip up every once in a while, but if you love someone, you'll work at it. So hopefully this video was helpful to you guys. I was recently in a video by BuzzFeed with a bunch of really cool trans people like Bunk Angel and Ian Harvey and Kate Borenstein, and we made a video about pronouns. So I will put a link, I'll put an annotation somewhere in this video to that video so you can go and watch that. And as per usual, always remember and never forget that you are beautiful and you're loved. Bye.
I love that Cat Black video. I think that something that I pull from it every time is that really, really engaging with people and engaging in community and showing people care and love is that phrase that she said around, you might not always understand, but if you love somebody, you will try at it. And I think that that's really beautiful and necessary. At Portland Community College, our Queer Resource Centers our coordinators here developed a Portland Community College Mad Lib. I don't know if you all remember Mad Libs or ever played with Mad Libs, but they're word games to fill in a blank, and they're usually used with kiddos to teach about verbs and nouns and adjectives. And the QRCs here use that Mad Lib as a practicing tool to practice gender-neutral pronouns. So I thought that we could also engage with a practicing tool for gender-neutral pronouns using they, them, and theirs pronouns and the fictional Mad Lib on the right side of this slide. Feel free to write it down or to speak it out loud to your computer screen. I think it's important to hear it and it's important to say it. So if you want to practice with a colleague right now that you're tuning in with, or if you want to write it down and practice writing it, we will read through it in like 20 seconds. So the PCC Mad Lib is slightly longer, and it can be found on the QRC resource page if anybody's interested in borrowing the format for your own campuses. And it's about our mascot, Poppy the Panther, who does not have a gender. And so the QRC coordinators here have curated that Mad Lib, and when they run presentations, we usually popcorn having folks read out the phrases so that we can all practice together. Since we're not together in the same space, I'll read this now, but feel free to read aloud in your spaces. Jamie is excited to attend the OE conference. They have never been to a conference before. All of their friends have said that the conference is awesome. They are also stoked about presenting. It will be the first time for them to debut a new workshop style. So I mentioned earlier that I asked the question, what happens when we step outside of the gender boxes, and what happens to us when we don't align with those gender boxes? I think it's really important to talk about oppression based on gender. It's really hard to do a workshop or a webinar without talking about isms. So prejudice plus power equals an ism. Prejudice is a preconceived opinion that's not based on reason or actual experience, and power is the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. It's a right or an authority that is a given or delegated to a person or body. A lot of folks typically recognize sexism and transmisogyny. Those two, I think, are more frequently used. Sexism is, prejudice plus power, to exert power over people who do not align, it perpetuates the patriarchy, people who don't align as men or as heterosexual or as heteronormative. Transmisogyny is transphobia against trans women or trans femmes. But cissexism, I feel like, is not always as talked about and is being used more frequently than transphobia. Transphobia generally describes fear of trans people or power plus prejudice at an individual level, while cissexism generally names the systemic oppression of trans individuals. And I have an image of the all-gender bathroom on the slide because I think that we can watch institutionalized cissexism play out and transphobia play out in our world around us. And one really salient example that's been high in the media recently in the last few years has been looking at bathrooms and who has access to a bathroom, which is a human right. And a lot of the dialogue and the discourse has been centered within a cis-sexist framework. So we're seeing oppression based on gender in this very salient and real way. But I think it's really important to sort of land here together, talking about how gender affects people and how oppression based on gender is insidious and salient and here. And so we've got to name it. The last slide I have for you is just resources. I'm really happy that we could engage together. If you have any questions at all, I'm happy to open up the floor in a second, but I also wanted to drop my email address. Would love to continue the conversation with folk. So feel free to reach out at any time. I also wanted to put these 3 resources up. The Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, they do a lot of free webinars on trans inclusion. And I know we ended sort of on an oppression based on gender note, and it's still super widely prevalent in our communities. So making sure that we're connected to folks who can support. And then there's also Forge is the second one. It's a national transgender anti-violence organization with tons of online resources about supporting trans folks who are experiencing DVSA. And then TSER, which is the Trans Student Educational Resource. They're amazing. And they have a bunch of artwork that can be purchased. So if you're looking to decorate a space with some really inclusive and wonderful artwork curated by trans folks of color, they're a great place to go. And they also have a lot of resource guides. So if you're looking for something specific, a resource guide specific to your resource center or your age group, you can find a lot of resources there. So that is all I have. I'd love to stay on the line though if folks have questions.
First of all, Brianna, I just wanted to thank you so much. That was a great webinar. I think this is an awesome way to kick off, I guess, end 2018 and prep for the conference and the conversation we're going to have as part of OWHE over the next year or so. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And if folks have questions, feel free to just type them right into the chat box, and I guess you can see my screen, so I'll be looking at them. Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah, totally. Forward Together is an awesome organization that does a ton of work at the intersection of race and gender and sexuality and class. And they have on their website tons of resources in Spanish. So their name again is Forward Together. And then I believe TSER has resources in Spanish as well. So I would check out TSER and Forward Together. If anybody else can think of resources that are in Spanish around the intersection of gender, feel free to drop those in the chat box.
Well, if there are no more questions, I just wanted to thank you once again for sharing this with us, and we look forward to hearing more from you soon.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here. Bye.